Arizona Territory, 1882. The sun had just begun to sink low, laying long shadows across the desert floor, when Caleb Wyatt reined his horse toward the narrow trail by Dust Creek. Folks knew him as a silent rancher, a man of few words who carried the weight of sorrow in his eyes. Rumors trailed him like dust. How he had once buried a wife and child, how laughter had left him and never returned. He never confirmed it. He just worked his cattle, rode into town for supplies, and returned to the lonely ranch tucked deep in the valley. That evening, the desert offered him something he wasn't looking for. Up ahead, he saw movement, small, struggling, almost too fragile to notice against the vast emptiness. Slowing his horse, he spotted a little girl, no more than 8 years old, dragging someone much heavier than herself. Her tiny arms strained under the burden, her face smudged with dust, her steps stumbling. Caleb swung down from his saddle. The girl froze when she saw him, her eyes wide, torn between terror and hope. The figure she was trying to carry was a young woman, unconscious, her breathing shallow, her head lolling against the child's shoulder. The girl's lips trembled as she whispered, "Please, mister, if you can take someone, take her instead of me." Her voice cracked like brittle wood, but her arms tightened around the limp body she guarded. Caleb stood there a moment, silent, the desert wind tugging at his coat. His jaw tightened, his throat working. Then he stepped forward, lifted the woman gently into his arms, swung her across his saddle, and extended a hand down to the girl. He didn't take one. He took both. His ranch lay in a valley most people avoided. Weathered boards, quiet corrals, a place haunted by silence. But that night, lamplight flickered inside, and the rooms echoed with sounds that hadn't been heard there in years. Soft voices, footsteps that weren't his alone. The girl said her name was Rosie, her voice trembling but polite. The unconscious woman was her older sister, Elena, between mouthfuls of beans that Caleb had cooked in his iron pot. Rose explained what had happened. Their family had been traveling west in a wagon when bandits struck. Their parents hadn't survived. She and Elena had fled on foot, but Elena had collapsed with fever. Rosie had been dragging her, step by painful step, until Caleb appeared. Caleb didn't speak much. He fetched water, tended the fire, and kept his hands busy with chores. But Rosie noticed how he left food beside her without being asked, how he checked Elena's breathing through the night, how he never raised his voice. She followed him like a small sparrow, her boots crunching in the dirt as he fed the horses. She asked questions he rarely answered, yet she filled the silence as if determined to soften it. For nearly a week, Elena hovered at the edge of life. Caleb nursed her through fever, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, sitting steady by her side when she thrashed in delirium. Rosie would curl up nearby, whispering prayers in the dark. On the 5th morning, Elena opened her eyes. They were dark brown, confused but steady, her lips parted, dry and weak. "You're safe?" Caleb said, his voice rough from disuse. They were the first words she heard from him. Rosie smiled faintly at the sound, as if proud that she had coaxed something out of the man. Days bled into weeks. Elena grew stronger, though her grief was harder to mend. She insisted on helping around the ranch, cooking, mending, even daring to ride out and help with the cattle. Caleb resisted at first, but there was a quiet determination in her that matched his. One afternoon in the barn, she finally asked a question she'd been holding back. "Why did you help us, Mr. Wyatt? Men don't usually risk themselves for strangers." His hand stilled on the bridle strap. His jaw worked before he answered, and when he did, his voice was low, almost broken, because once no one came for mine. He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. Elena stepped closer, laid a gentle hand on his arm, and in that silence something shifted between them, an understanding, fragile but real. Rosie grew attached quickly. One evening, she sat on the porch beside him, the sky burning orange and purple. She was small, her legs dangling above the ground, her hands folded in her lap. After a long silence, she spoke softly. "You didn't just take her instead of me. You took us both." Caleb's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Sometimes silence carried more than words ever could. But peace in the desert is fragile. Word came that the same bandits who had destroyed Elena and Rosie's family were riding north, burning wagons and leaving ruin in their wake. One night, smoke curled on the horizon. Caleb knew trouble was coming. He gathered Elena and Rosie inside the ranch house, his face grim. Rosie clutched at his sleeve, her eyes wide. "Will you leave us too?" she asked. Caleb crouched so his gaze met hers. His expression was weathered, but there was a steadiness in his voice. "No, little one, I already chose." When the bandits came, the night split open with gunfire. Caleb fought like a man who had something left to protect. Elena refused to cower. She loaded rifles, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. Rosie, small but brave, darted between them, carrying cartridges, whispering, "Here, here," as if her presence alone could keep them standing. By dawn, the ranch still stood. Smoke curled upward, but the bandits had fled into the desert, leaving the valley quiet again. As the sun climbed, Caleb stood on the porch with Elena at his side. Rosie leaned against him, half asleep, her small hand gripping his coat. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the weight in his chest ease. The silence of the ranch wasn't empty anymore. It was full of footsteps, voices, laughter that would surely come. He hadn't just taken them and out of duty. He had found something he thought was gone forever, a family, and though he never said it aloud, the truth settled in his heart as steady as the rising sun. When Rosie had asked him to take her sister instead of her, he hadn't answered then, but his choice had been made the moment he reached down his hand. He would take them both. Always. The ranch carried a new sound in the weeks that followed, the sound of life. Once, it had been nothing but the creak of a lonely windmill and the shuffle of boots in dust. Now laughter echoed from the porch. Pots clanged in the kitchen, and Rosie's voice carried across the fields as she tried to sing to the horses. The silence that had haunted Caleb's land for years was broken, and though he'd never say out loud, he didn't mind. Elena settled in as though she had always belonged. She moved through the small house with a quiet grace, sweeping floors, patching torn shirts, leaving the place warmer without changing a single wall. Caleb noticed the way the light caught in her hair when she leaned over the stove, the way she stood strong in the face of work that would break most women. She never complained, never faltered, though her eyes sometimes clouded with grief when she thought no one was looking. Caleb did look. He saw more than he let on. Rosie shadowed him everywhere. At first he thought it would be bothersome, a child clinging to his side while he tried to mend fences or ride out to check the herd. But the little girl had a way of softening things. She asked questions he couldn't answer, told him stories that made no sense, and sometimes just hummed while he worked. It had been years since anyone had filled the air around him with such simple, unguarded life. One evening, as he fixed a broken stirrup by lantern light, she sat on an overturned bucket beside him and asked, "Mr. Wyatt, are we staying forever?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept working, his silence heavy. But after a long moment, he said softly, "As long as you want." Her smile, small but sure, told him she had taken that as a promise. But the desert was not kind to promises. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dust trailed behind the horse, like a warning. Caleb stepped out from the barn, his hand near the revolver at his hip. The rider slowed as he neared, tipping his hat, but not smiling. His name was Clay Harlow, a rancher from 2 valleys over. Trouble had a way of following him. "Word is," Clay drawled, "you've been harboring survivors from that wagon attack." His eyes flicked toward the house where Elena stood in the doorway, her hand resting protectively on Rosie's shoulder. "Bandits left them for dead. Folks say if you meddle with their work, you bring their anger down on yourself. Maybe you've already seen that." Caleb's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his silence was a wall that Clay couldn't push through. After a tense pause, Clay spat in the dirt, turned his horse, and rode off. Elena's face was pale as she stepped onto the porch. "They'll come again, won't they?" she asked quietly. Caleb gave a slow nod. Maybe. That night, as Rosie slept in the loft, Caleb and Elena sat at the table by lantern light. For the first time, she pressed him, "Why do you carry this alone? Why won't you let anyone in?" He met her gaze, the shadows flickering across his worn face. "Because everyone I let in gets taken." His voice was raw, broken, the wound laid bare. Elena reached across the table, her hand finding his. For a moment, he almost pulled away, but then he let it rest there. Her warmth grounded him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Not everyone," she whispered. The days grew tense after that. Caleb reinforced fences, stored extra ammunition, and kept his rifle close. Elena helped in every way she could, learning to shoot with a steady hand, though Caleb hated putting the weapon in her grip. Rosie, sensing the unease, stayed close, her laughter softer, her eyes watching the horizon as though she too expected danger to ride in at any moment. It came one evening, sudden and cruel. Shots cracked in the distance as bandits swept through a neighbor's ranch. Smoke rose against the sunset. Caleb saddled his horse, rifle in hand, but Elena caught his arm. "You can't fight them all," she said. He looked at her, the weight of loss heavy in his eyes. "I can't stand by while they burn others out like they did to you." Her grip tightened, fear cleared her gaze, but she let him go. The fight at the neighbor's ranch was brutal, dust and fire swirling in the twilight. Caleb held his ground, his rifle barking in steady rhythm. But there were too many. He was driven back, outnumbered, and only by sheer grit did he manage to escape alive. He rode home battered, blood streaking his sleeve, his body aching. Elena met him at the porch, her hands trembling as she pressed a cloth to his wound. "You'll get yourself killed," she whispered fiercely, tears burning her eyes. Rosie clung to his other arm, whispering, "Don't leave us." And in that moment, Caleb realized it wasn't just his fight anymore. He wasn't a solitary man defending empty land. He had something, someone worth protecting. In the days that followed, neighbors began to gather. Clay Harlow returned, not with threats this time, but with grim resolve. "Those bandits won't stop until we drive them out," he said. For the first time in years, Caleb found himself standing among other men, planning, preparing. Elena stood with him, her chin lifted, her courage shining. When the final clash came, it was at dawn. Gunfire echoed across the valley, the sharp cry of horses mixing with the crack of rifles. Caleb fought with the fury of a man who had lost once and refused to lose again. Elena kept Rosie safe in the cellar, though her heart ached with every shot she heard. The battle was long, the dust thick, but when the sun was high, the valley fell silent again. The bandits were broken, scattered into the desert. Caleb returned to the ranch, weary but alive. Elena rushed to meet him, her arms wrapping around him before she could stop herself. He held her close, his silence speaking louder than words. Rosie squeezed between them, her little arms wrapping around both, her voice muffled but clear. "We're safe now." Caleb looked down at the two of them, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a smile. It was small, uncertain, but real. He hadn't just saved them. They had saved him, too. And as the sun dipped low, casting the land in gold, Caleb Wyatt knew one truth, as sure as the desert wind. He would never let them go. Not the woman who had taught him to feel again. Not the child who had given him a reason to live. When Rosie had begged him months ago to take her sister instead of her, he hadn't answered. But his answer was written now in every choice, every breath, every heartbeat. He had taken them both, and he always would. The valley looked different after the smoke cleared. For years Caleb had ridden those pastures with only silence for company. Now he heard the sound of Rosie's laughter chasing chickens to the yard, Elena humming softly as she hung linens in the sun, the creak of a rocker on the porch that hadn't been touched since his wife died. The ranch wasn't a graveyard anymore. It was alive. Caleb told himself it was temporary. He told himself Elena and Rosie would move on once they were strong enough, once they had kin somewhere to claim them. But weeks turned into months, and still they stayed. Elena mended more than shirts. She mended the broken corners of the house. Curtains hung where bare windows had gaped. Flowers, stubborn but bright, bloomed in a row along the porch. Rosie painted the barn door with sloppy sunbursts that made Caleb shake his head but never scold. The neighbors who had once kept their distance began to notice the change. At Sunday service in Dust Creek, Caleb walked in with Elena at his side and Rosie skipping ahead. The room went still for a moment. Folks weren't used to seeing him like that. Shoulders not quite so hunched, eyes not quite so shadowed. Some whispered, some smiled. Clay Harlow, who had fought beside him against the bandits, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good to see you back among the living, Wyatt." Caleb didn't answer, but Elena saw the faintest twitch of his mouth, as if the words had struck something true. But not everyone welcomed the change. A few townsfolk muttered that Elena and Rosie weren't Caleb's blood. Some looked at Elena with suspicion. An outsider, a burden, a reminder of violence. Caleb said nothing, but when he rode home with her hand steady on Rosie's shoulder, his jaw was set hard enough to crack stone. Life on the ranch settled into rhythm. Caleb worked the cattle. Elena tended the house. Rosie followed both of them with equal devotion. Yet beneath the surface, something unspoken simmered. Caleb found himself watching Elena in quiet moments. The way she laughed with Rosie, the way she walked with her hair loose in the wind. He told himself it was just gratitude. But gratitude didn't make his heart stumble when her hand brushed his. Gratitude didn't make him linger in the doorway, just to hear her voice. One evening, after Rosie had gone to bed, Caleb sat on the porch steps while Elena joined him with 2 cups of coffee. The night was cool, the stars sharp as glass overhead. She handed him a cup, then sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Elena said quietly, "You built your life on silence, Caleb Wyatt, but silence won't keep people close." He stared into the dark fields, the steam curling from his cup. "Silence is all I had left." "And now?" she asked, her voice gentle but sure. His throat worked. He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he shifted, letting their shoulders brush, letting her warmth soak through the armor he'd carried for years. It was a small thing, but it was enough. Elena didn't press further. She just stayed there, steady as the stars above. As summer deepened, storms rolled across the desert, bringing rain that soaked the parched land. One storm, fierce and sudden, flooded Dust Creek and cut off several families from town. Caleb saddled his horse before dawn, Elena already packing food and blankets. Together they rode through the driving rain to help. Rosie, left behind with a neighbor, watched them disappear with wide eyes. Through mud and rising waters, Caleb and Elena hauled children across swollen streams, guided wagons to higher ground, handed out food. Elena worked with strength that stunned even him. By the time the storm passed, neighbors looked at her differently, not as a burden, but as a woman who had stood firm when others faltered. That night, drenched and exhausted, they returned to the ranch. Elena stood in the doorway, dripping rain onto the floor, laughing softly despite her weariness. Caleb looked at her, and something inside him shifted fully, finally. He stepped closer, his hand lifting as if unsure, then settling against her cheek. She stilled, her breath catching. For a long moment, he simply held her gaze. Then, with the gentleness of a man afraid to break something precious, he kissed her. It wasn't fiery, not yet. It was steady, certain, the kind of kiss that carried years of silence breaking apart. Elena leaned into it, her hand finding his chest, her heart pounding beneath her palm. When they parted, she whispered, "So you do still know how to speak?" Caleb's lips almost curved into a smile. Almost. Rosie, of course, noticed a change long before either of them admitted it. She began calling them we in every sentence. When we go to town, when we fix the fence, when we sit on the porch. One evening she asked, as only a child could, "Mr. Wyatt, if you're my pa now, does that mean Miss Elena is my ma?" Caleb nearly choked on his coffee, but Elena, cheeks pink, just smiled and said softly, "Something like that, Rosie." The ranch was no longer just a place to survive. It was a place to belong. But belonging brought its own tests. One day a letter arrived, worn from travel. It bore Elena's family name. Her uncle in California had heard of the tragedy and offered her and Rosie a place with him. Elena read the letter in silence, her hands trembling. Caleb saw the conflict in her eyes. Blood ties pulling one way, the life they had built pulling another. That night, she stood on the porch with the letter folded tight in her hand. "He can give Rosie safety, schooling, things I can't." Her voice was heavy with doubt. Caleb stood beside her, his face unreadable. "And what do you want?" he asked quietly. She looked at him then, eyes bright with tears. "I want what we've built here, but I don't know if that's selfish." Caleb reached for her hand. Steady and sure. Wanting to stay isn't selfish. It's choosing. When Rosie woke the next morning, she found the letter burned to ash in the fire. She didn't ask questions. She only hugged both of them tight, her little face glowing with relief. Seasons turned. Autumn painted the valley gold. Caleb, Elena, and Rosie stood together at the edge of the corral, watching the herd graze. Elena slipped her hand into his, and he didn't pull away. Rosie leaned against his side, chattering about a colt she wanted to name Sunbeam. Caleb listened, silent as always, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was full, a belonging of love, of a future he had once thought lost. When Rosie had begged him months ago to take her sister instead of her, Caleb hadn't answered. He had simply acted. And in the end, that choice had led him here, to this porch, this family, this life. He hadn't taken one. He hadn't even taken both. They had taken him. Two. And together, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were home.